The question is, as we go through this transition, what's the collateral damage going to be? And that's when you start to flirt with notions of a potential global or regional war. And that's when you start to flirt with notions of sort of revolutionary anarchy on the way to get there. And those things could happen. We'll have to see. Real political change, Christian, is happening from outside the system, because inside the system, it's too rotten. The internals are completely broken. So, what does that mean? Well, some people would call that a fourth turning. Maybe. What I would suggest is that we're entering a kind of succession, not secession, where states sort of secede from the overall structure, but actually that the constitutional form of government that we have known more or less since the 1780s, that is ending.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is Cameron McGregor, who's the creator of Men and the City, whose work you can find on Substack as well as on YouTube. His platform covers finance, freedom, neo-masculinity, and a myriad of other topics that are, I think, very much germane to most of us tuning in. Cameron, it's an honor to meet you, and great to have a fellow Navy vet on the show.
Yeah, good evening, shipmate. Thanks for hosting me on your burgeoning platform, and hopefully we can have an energetic conversation about a better future than most people think is possible.
100%, 100%. Well, I figured we kind of start off with kind of your latest take on what the world, where we're at this time.
So let's try to reframe exactly where we are uh, in a geopolitical sense, because I think a lot of folks in the United States are of a particular mindset. That's probably accurate. They tend to be more declinist. They see things sort of imploding in the West, and I think in many ways that's true. And they tend to see consistency with that around the world. And I think a large part of that, Christian, is because people don't travel much. So a little bit of background on me: I have been to over 35 countries. I've lived all over the world, including Asia, South America, been to the Middle East, and I'm currently in Europe. So when you travel, one of the things that you notice right away, particularly for those who've been to China, and I'm fortunate to have been there, is that the world is radically different today than it was in the 1990s. Radically different. And that does not necessarily suggest a chaotic world. So a lot of the folks that come on your platform probably think that the world is descending into Hobbesian anarchy and chaos, when I would suggest to you that actually what's occurring is a redistribution of power, a reordering of the world. In many ways, it will make it more stable, not less. However, the United States, which internally I think is very unstable, is reacting to this in a way that's particularly troubling. And that's why you're seeing conflict in fault lines around the world, be that in Ukraine, which is a proxy war between Russia and the West. And we can talk more about that in just a moment if you want. A proxy war in the Middle East, certainly between Israel and Iran, but that um, has geopolitical implications for the United States because of our close ties to Israel, which I think are not going to be in place much longer, hopefully. Or this burgeoning conflict in Venezuela, which is another sort of geopolitical proxy war that it seems is being fought between the United States, China, and others that are vying for influence in South America. How does the view look from Washington D.C.? So there's a French general that became famous during the First Battle of the Marne, Ferdinand Foch. And he said, "My center is giving way, my right is retreating, situation excellent, I am attacking." Now, that happened to work out for him, but I would submit that that is basically the Trump administration's foreign policy. The center, if you will, is the financial system. And that is very definitely giving way for reasons we can elaborate on in just a moment. His right, if you will, is the American empire, or at least the monetary empire. And that is also in retreat. And so, in response to all of this, the Trump administration has decided to attack. How are they attacking? Well, they are retrenching around Ukraine. They are consolidating around Israel, which is what we saw this summer in this sort of 12-day skirmish with Iran. That potentially could get much worse, and I think it may. And they're sanctioning or tariffing the world with the idea that they will consolidate around the dollar, that they will prevent these alternative monetary vehicles from growing, specifically the BRICS. But I would say to stop de-dollarization, because their view is that protecting the dollar, specifically the Trump cohort. These are people like Howard Lutnick, his Commerce Secretary, or Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary. The Wall Street component of the Trump administration, they view de-dollarization as a direct threat to the United States. I do not see it that way at all, but that's the way they see it. And as a result, their concept is basically we're going to bludgeon the rest of the world through weaponizing the dollar. We're going to intimidate them with sanctions or potential sanctions, or we are going to fight kinetic operations. So, in a nutshell, you have a world that's shifting dramatically into a more multipolar, redistributed order of power, and a legacy power structure that's doing everything it can, it seems, to stop that. And that has been conducive to real conflict all around the world. However, internally in the United States, not everybody shares that vision, and this is sort of the emergence of the America First movement, which still remains very inchoate and is pushing back not just against Donald Trump's administration, but against the uniparty itself, which represents a kind of politics that I think is dying. So, in a nutshell, if you sort of reframe along the lines that I've described, you see a very different world, a world that's not descending into anarchy and chaos as much as a world that's reorganizing itself, and probably in more sustainable ways. It's very difficult, maybe even dangerous, to have a unipower that has disproportionate power and influence on the world. If nothing else, that's probably what the United States has demonstrated since 1945. So that's how I see things. That's how I see things at sort of the strategic level.
Now you highlighted several things that I'd love to dive in with you. I guess most recent you just mentioned about the kind of schism that's kind of going on within, you might call it, MAGA within, the Republicans, and so on and so forth. And I think that's been a very interesting observation that I've had as I've seen the discourse on X, which I've recently started kind of getting back on. I'm just floored by what is on the platform, and perhaps you could kind of share your thoughts on that.
So yeah, so let's take a step back for a moment and try to process what's happening in the United States, and specifically with the U.S. government. So a lot of folks, particularly discerning people in finance and elsewhere, are very paranoid. They're fearful because they have been trained to fear concentration of power. There's merit to that, and that can also be exaggerated. In many ways, concentration of power is actually necessary for the United States to reform and reorganize itself. And that is really the crisis that we face. The United States is facing a crisis of identity. In a political sense, we're facing a crisis of reform. So if you reframe a little bit, look at the Fed, for example. The Fed is 100-plus-year institution. That means that a lot of the tools, the models that it's using are anachronistic. It's trying to apply a monetary tool set to a system that's already changed. And as a result, the Fed as an institution is beginning internally to wobble. This is why you see conflict on the Federal Reserve Board for the first time in decades. That's why you're seeing people pull towards different sides of the dual mandate. Some people believe that inflation should be prioritized. Other people believe it should be the labor market. Some people think it should be regulating the financial system writ large. This is pulling the institution apart, and it's raising real questions of credibility. Credibility that could jeopardize the Fed's existence as an institution. I can't stress that enough. At the same time, you're seeing institutions like the Great Society, so Medicare, Medicaid, what the welfare state as we understand it today, which is completely unaffordable, is also become ungovernable, in part because it's a legacy program. It's anachronistic. It just doesn't work very well. That dovetails with the New Deal. So the New Deal gave us Social Security, which is effectively a retirement program for the entire country. It was never designed to be so. It was designed to be temporary, and that grandfathered itself in. That too is also ungovernable. At the same time, you have the military-industrial complex, and the military-industrial complex goes back to the 1950s. It was largely a product of the Korean War, which we were singularly unprepared for, and that produced a deluge of spending to create the nuclear triad. Unfortunately, a byproduct of that, as you well know, was this sort of Goliath, this Leviathan that we call the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in the 1950s, and that has gotten completely out of control. We have not been able to audit defense spending, for example, since the 1990s. So there's a real question of supervisory authority over the government as structured. And then if you look at the elected government, well, trust and confidence in Congress as an institution is at an all-time low. That mirrors what you're seeing in the private sector too. People don't trust the Fortune 500 companies. They don't trust the media. There is a real loss of faith, right? And that creates a crisis of authority. In the vacuum of that collapse of confidence have been new movements that have sprouted, particularly online. And this is something that I've written about for some time, but essentially what you have is a shift in the political media landscape in this country that really goes back to 2000. When 2008 occurred, essentially what it did is it broke a social contract for the younger generation in this country, of whom I'm a part. So technically, you and I, being about 40 and younger, are millennials. Millennials will never be able to acquire the kind of wealth that our parents' generation did, even that Gen X did. And the reason for that is because when the bailouts occurred in 2008, that sort of standard 9 to 5 trajectory, go to college, take out loans to do it, get your first job, meet the right girl, marry the girl, go to the suburbs, have 2.5 kids or what have you. Um, that structure of life is gone. And that started to manifest itself about 10 to 15 years ago and create a cauldron of social scarring. And so men found themselves, in many cases, as ninjas, no incomes, no jobs, no assets, outside of a small tranche at the top. And so what they did is they started questioning all kinds of things about the way the United States government operates, paradigmatic thinking in the United States that suggested, for example, that open borders was a good thing, that multiculturalism was a good thing, that the United States is the indispensable arbiter of peace and prosperity around the world. And the product of that politically has been America First. And that also produced a candidate in 2016 that sort of shook up the political landscape. That was Donald Trump. Unfortunately, Donald Trump, like a lot of reform movements in the country, has failed to realize the promise of that electoral energy. And it's largely concentrated in these younger people who feel as though the country has betrayed them in particular. As a result of that failure, which has been confirmed this second go around, and I would argue that Trump 2.0 is even worse than the first iteration of Donald Trump for reasons that we can discuss. That now is creating real fragmentation. And as a result, you're seeing a split on both the right and the left. The old guard Republicans, they're falling away. They're losing credibility. Not necessarily on Capitol Hill, not yet, but certainly with the public at large. Their credibility is falling. And this ascendant movement, which is largely concentrated online and hasn't really created anything new yet in terms of real party, that's coming. That's the future. And I suspect that something similar is happening on the left as well, where the old guard that has been a stalwart of old guard Democratic politics is giving way to a new brand of Democratic politics. This is sort of like the Justice Democrats. So the legacy party structures are and fragmenting, and new movements are becoming ascendant. And I would suggest the American First movement is probably the most salient of that.
As it relates to that movement, you hear a lot of, you have Tucker, Candace, et cetera. And then you've got perhaps Shapiro and Levin, and you see that. I mean, just using that as an illustration of this kind of divergence, this schism that has arisen. And it, you hear a lot about fourth turning and cycles, and I'm a big history guy, as you can kind of see kind of behind me. I sense where the puck is going is that we're entering hairier and hairier times. What is what would be your take?
So we have reached a point in the United States, and this is, I think, the nexus point for all of the topics that you discuss on your platform, whether it's geopolitics, which we just sort of covered a moment ago, or it's macroeconomics, Fed policy, uh, America first, the sort of uniparty, all of it together essentially has created a system that's running on empty, and that is acutely the case in the financial system, which it seems is really beginning to blow up for all kinds of reasons. As a result of that, and I happen to think that we have been in a kind of pseudo financial crisis since 2020. The financial plumbing has sort of kept us afloat, if you will. But the real economy itself, which I think divorced from the financial markets in 2008 and has sort of been limping along ever since, both are beginning to sort of overheat and crash. And I say that because even though there's been political dysfunction, even though there have been immigration problems, even though there is a sort of loss of trust and confidence, the one thing that's kept everything together is that the baby boomers are still getting their dividend checks, that the younger generation is still sort of distracted by meme stocks, right? That there is still this vague potential of accumulating wealth, albeit in the financial system, even though I think ultimately that's corrosive. But that's beginning to sort of crater, beginning to give way. And so real political change, Christian, is happening from outside the system because inside the system, it's too rotten. The internals are completely broken. So, what does that mean? Well, some people would call that a fourth turning. Maybe. What I would suggest is that we're entering a kind of succession, not secession, where states sort of secede from the overall structure, but actually that the constitutional form of government that we have known more or less since the 1780s, that is ending. And that means that the nation state, as we think of it, has bifurcated. Doesn't mean the collapse of the United States. What it means is that the state, the constitutional order that underpins that state, that is collapsing and that a new order is going to emerge. Now, exactly what that means at this stage is hard to say. It's fairly nebulous. But as I said earlier, the media landscape is changing, the political landscape is changing, and you're starting to see new monetary organizations too, like the Bitcoiners, for example, which itself is an attempt, if you will, to completely overhaul the legacy banking system. Yes, it's sort of become a speculation, but all of these things are pointing you in a direction that suggests that we're going to overhaul the constitutional order of the country. It's sort of just going to grind to a halt. How does that happen? Bankruptcy. That's the default position that we're headed to, because that's going to completely rip apart the social contract as we understand it. That means that pensioners aren't going to get their pensions. It means that the economy, which is probably, I don't know, two-thirds to three-quarters driven by government spending, that is going to grind to a halt. And a lot of the problems that we've ignored or buried for a long time, like open borders, right? Like this sort of collapse of the rule of law, those things are going to get fixed. And they're going to get fixed by, I would say, a mass movement, a new exogenous political organization that fills that vacuum.
Boy, we could go off in a million different directions here. This is definitely fascinating. Well, first to bring up something that you mentioned a little bit earlier on, as somebody who is in his mid 30s, um, you know, I I have observed just whether it's on social media or just out and about, that discourse amongst the millennial demographic, call it Gen Z as well, and the bifurcation between X and the boomer generation and such. And it is very interesting how stratified things have become, and and particularly with relationships. And I'm just deviating here for a bit, a moment, but I think this is germane in that so many people. Uh, th- so many people, it is interesting to observe are single, and then you also look at the polarization of things, people becoming more siloed, people are more on drugs, lonely, mental health, a myriad of other things, and that is obviously a derivative of the financial system by and large, in the I guess the deep politics that exists. And it's just so fascinating to observe that. And even not to talk too much about myself here, but even for myself, I had to restart in some sense a couple years ago, and I was blown away by again, this is someone in their 30s. I feel like I've done a thing or two relative to my age, and had no traction when I wanted to apply for different career opportunities. I mean, nothing. And I'd even written a book on it, which is kind of embarrassing on another note. And I have extensive relationships. Part of it was ego. So, I guess in some sense, I feel like I was kind of part of that cohort where I was just like ready to check out literally, and then just start a business from scratch. I had no background in, and so I'm just kind of sharing that to kind of edify what you're getting at. It is very interesting to observe, and I have a family member who is at home still, and is just kind of checked out. And so it is very real, for sure. And I just see it, through media and just through walking around, going to the store, and
Yeah, I mean, I think your story is illustrative. And let's go back to something that you said a moment ago, that the money is at the center of it. I think that's true to a degree. Certainly, the financial system is symptomatic. I'm not sure it's the catalyst for all of our problems. I think the United States, as I said a moment ago, is really experiencing a crisis of identity. And the way I try to help people reframe is that the United States has gone through, I think, four iterations. So the first is after the War of Separation. Now, people call this the Revolutionary War. I think that's a bad word to use for the same reason that de Tocqueville said America became a democracy without having to suffer a democratic revolution. Effectively, what we did in the 1770s is we had achieved escape velocity as an independent peoples. Now, we weren't necessarily a consolidated nation per se, but we had onboarded the best that British civilization had to offer. So we had patent systems, we had a rule of law, we had courts, we had a concept of private property, we had a common language, a common religion, a common culture, a common ethnos. And that meant that we could essentially pursue our own destiny. And that's what we decided to do in the 70s. So we split from our imperial patriarch and became something new. That started sort of a society of free states, what some people would call a Jeffersonian America. So you had a state structure that was sovereign, so states of states. The problem with that is that ultimately these states, which had right to secede, and that's why you had Virginia and West Virginia and so forth, ultimately you had conflict between this concept of Lincolnian America and a Jeffersonian America. And that was that Lincoln believed the states came from the Union, not the other way around. And that happened to center on this issue called slavery. But in principle, this was a disagreement about how the United States would be governed. And that kicked off the next iteration of the country. So effectively, we became a federalized country or a Lincolnian society. And that transitioned us into a more industrial country, right? A nation of industrial autarky, if you will. That's really when the United States was built, from about 1870 until 1970. And that, I think, unified the country in some very salient ways. That all changed in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we went through a kind of overhaul of everything. And this is well documented, right? We experienced a cultural revolution of sorts. And really, what that meant is we experienced a turnover of elites that rejected that previous America in favor of what I've called pluralism. So by 1969, you have elites like Susan Sontag who basically say that white America or whites are the cancer of human civilization. This is the new mentality, and so we, as the founding ethnos of the country, effectively accommodated a new credo, and that became multiculturalism. And that also separated us from the institutions of power, from the institutions of the state. So, what once was very clear, what language we spoke, what our identity was, what our heritage was, all of a sudden now it became a whole range of different things. And that pulled us away from the systems of power and governance. It also restaffed our society. So, instead of being a merit based country and economy, we became one that was focused on redistributing not just wealth, but also talent, right? On equal distribution of population, right? So creating affirmative action and force feeding representation of populations in the Fortune 500 companies, in the military, and the government. Well, that system has broken down completely. And now we're sort of disintegrating into these various tribal entities. And that's what has brought us to a point of war of integration. So now this sort of split between the nation and the state is now beginning to recombine itself or reintegrate itself. In other words, you're beginning to see America first again, right? You're beginning to see that sort of heritage ethnos become politically assertive again to say, hey, look, I want to take back my country. The problem is that the political vessel to do that, which is the MAGA movement and Donald Trump, has essentially been captured by the state. And the state and the financial system are basically one. The good news, however, is as I said earlier, that system is beginning to give way. It's beginning to crumble. And that's what you're seeing in the financial system as our indebtedness becomes unsustainable, as interest rates rise, as inflation becomes unsustainable for households that are living paycheck to paycheck. And so now you're beginning to see that sort of social contract really break and the next iteration of the country come to be. This is what I call succession. This is the future. This is where we're headed. Now, you could overlay that with the fourth turning. Maybe. I would just say that we're entering a period of profound reformism, and that necessitates a kind of financial collapse. So, a financial collapse is not going to be the end of the United States, right? The end of the dollar's world reserve currency is not going to be the end of the US of A. And neither will this sort of empire that we've constructed since 1945. If anything, we're going to be liberated by discarding those things, which have really perverted the national identity of the country. This is where we are. The question is, as we go through this transition, what's the collateral damage going to be? And that's when you start to flirt with notions of a potential global or regional war. And that's when you start to flirt with notions of sort of revolutionary anarchy on the way to get there. And those things could happen. We'll have to see.
What would be some, I mean, I guess obvious indicators would be protests, disruptions, further discourse. But I don't know if you could unpack, certain nodes or certain things that you're that you are, or certain trends that you're observing that when they hit a certain threshold, it's past the Rubicon, so to speak. You're like, okay, for sure, like this is where the puck is going.
Yeah, so in this regard, I think it's going to be financial, right? So if you go back to November of 2024 when Trump was elected, and you probably remember this well because it's so recent, there was a period of profound euphoria. The market soared to the high heavens. There was a lot of relief, and the sentiment was strong that Donald Trump had a reasonably good plan, that he was going to come into power having learned all the lessons this time that he didn't apply the first time, and that we would sort of retool and rewire and get back to growth. And needless to say, that didn't happen. But just to be very clear, that I think there were three things that the president was trying to achieve. The first is to disengage overseas, to end the forever wars, right? Remember, he famously, or rather infamously at this stage, said, um, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine with a phone call. Well, needless to say, we know how that went. He said essentially that he would pull back from these potential conflicts overseas, maybe end this humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Um, that pillar of his party policy or his platform has completely failed. And it's completely failed because his government has been saturated with the same people that have staffed every government over the last 50 years. These are more or less the same people that have gotten us involved in 80 to 100 regime changes since 1945. Donald Trump never really understood that. Instead, he capitulated to the donor class, among others, because he wanted to be president again. And so you get the same sort of Zionists or neoconservatives that have directed his foreign policy, and as a result, you get continuity. So that was the first pillar, and that failed. The second was financial or fiscal retrenchment. And this was tied to reorganizing the government. And the chief architect of that was Elon Musk, who was championing this Doge project, right? Department of Government Efficiency. Now, I never bought any of this per se, but some of what they discussed was absolutely appropriate. I mean, you probably remember Elon Musk said, "Look, we're gonna cut a trillion, maybe $2 trillion out of the U.S. budget in the first 12 months." That is a pretty grandiose plan and promise. Well, he lasted less than 180 days. He was gone. And he created a lot of rancor inside the administration, who basically concluded, well, we can't really cut government of any significance, so we're not even going to try. And instead, we're gonna implement this big, beautiful bill, and you get continuity once again. So basically, deficits and debts sky to the high heavens. And they've come up with some gambits for how to plug those gaps, which we can talk about too. But more or less, that mandate has collapsed. And then, thirdly, his commitment internally was to stabilize the economy and start to reindustrialize the country. Now, this was a tall task, to be sure. And I'm not sure Donald Trump fully understood, nor do I think he fully understands the extent of the deindustrialization in the country. But his plan, at least in this regard, was very clear. Whereas I think in the other cases, it wasn't. His plan was, well, I'm going to tariff the world, and I'm going to leverage tariffs and the importance, the indispensable U.S. markets to pull industry back into the country. Well, that all came to a head in April of this year, so-called Liberation Day, when one of his Wall Street advisors, Howard Lutnick, laid out this gigantic chart of absurd tariffs that caused a financial crisis of sorts right away. The dollar sank, stocks sank, and yields rose, which means U.S. Treasury bonds sold off. Why did that happen? Well, it happened because the world, as I said at the outset, has changed. China trades more with BRICS countries in the global south than they do with the United States and Europe combined. So it seems in that regard, our markets are not indispensable. Furthermore, the world has been de-dollarized. That's accelerated in the last few years. But if you use U.S. Treasury bonds as a proxy, Christian, more or less, there have been net selling of U.S. Treasury bonds since 2010. This is a massive structural problem that people have only just now started to notice, but they've started to sell in favor of gold, particularly in Asia and specifically in China. So that de-dollarization project, coupled with the strength of Chinese industry in particular, and bear in mind that what's happened in China, as I said at the outset of this interview, nothing short of transformation. China is at the vanguard of industrial economy. They make the best electric vehicles in the world. They are a leader in lithium batteries, in nuclear technology. Their grid, I would argue, is more advanced and modernized than ours is. They are at the forefront of industrial export in the world. The world needs Chinese goods because it's manufactured in an advanced industrial economy. It's effectively what the United States was in the 1950s. As a result of this, there hasn't been much movement to reindustrialize the country. And I would argue that what the president probably should have realized is that it's the financial system in the United States that's really the problem. And the financial system in the US has two pillars: it's Wall Street and it's Silicon Valley. And both have utterly failed as allocators of capital in the United States. And that's a big reason why you're starting to see real trouble in financial plumbing, because you have leverage upon leverage upon leverage, which has all been designed to finance speculative mania rather than real economy. right? Rather than building refineries and nuclear submarines and infrastructure. Instead, we are building the next AI bubble mania, this sort of thing. And it hasn't worked. So, in each of these mandates, the president, who was supposed to address, I would tell you, an economic crisis layered on top of social crises, he's failing. So, I think the answer to your question, Christian, is if the Trump administration really implodes, and I think that's what's happening as we speak, that could be the catalyst for a reorganization of the country, for a sort of capitulation that the democratic system, as we understand it, has completely broken. Does that mean violence in the street? Well, it may. It certainly may. How big a scale will that be? I don't know. What I do think is that what's happening in the online media, what's happening in these various subcommunities, is the beginnings of that reorganization. And as I said, that's what you're seeing in alternative media. That's what you're seeing in America First. That's what you're seeing in the Bitcoin community. These are all telling you, look, we got to organize differently if we're going to implement fundamental reform. And the last point I'll make on this is remember that if you add it all up, the promise of Donald Trump and MAGA was that you could get revolutionary change to address existential problems without having a revolution, that you could elect your way out of these problems. Donald Trump's failure, which I don't think is clear yet to everybody, when it becomes clear that he has been consumed by the system he was trying to fix, that's when you've entered that stage.
Now, as it relates to Trump, would you say that he is completely, I mean, more or less compromised?
I don't know that I would go that far. Although I do think that his bungling, and it's probably more of a public relations disaster than anything else, but his bungling of the Epstein files does raise real questions. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's compromised. What I would say is that Donald Trump never really understood what he was trying to fix. I think that Donald Trump, being the octogenarian that he is still sort of stuck in the 1950s, right? And this explains the military parades, renaming the Defense Department the Department of War. A lot of this stuff is revanchism because Donald Trump thinks, you know what, we are a few policies away from becoming great again. When actually, no, we need open heart surgery, right? Cosmetic reform, that was never going to cut it. And so what he did is he essentially turned to the same elites that got us into this mess to help get us out of it. And let's be clear about this idea of elite, because a lot of folks on your platform, I'm guessing, as I said, who are discerning and intelligent people paying attention to what's going on, they tend to assume three things about the elites. One, that they're monolithic. They're not. Second, that they're competent. There's serious reason to doubt that, particularly at this stage in the cycle. And thirdly, that they're self aware. It's noteworthy in terms of the self-aware component or the lack of self-awareness that all the big firms, KKR, Apollo, BlackRock, they're all intimately involved in the shadow banking catastrophe. And I would suggest that they're also inextricably tied to the AI bubble too. They can't help themselves. It's greed, right? So they're part of a self-destructive system. And by virtue of being part of a self-destructive system, you too are self-destructive. In addition to that, you've got, I would say, three types of elites. You've got financial elites. So these are the people that come from Wall Street, and they have gotten ferociously, hellaciously wealthy over the last 50 years. But that's not because of guile or competence. These people are not titans of industry. They're collecting dividends, right? They have invested in financial instruments that have made them extraordinarily wealthy. That does not necessarily reflect discipline or confidence or anything else. Or it's been some combination of corruption, grift, and simply owning equities, right? That have just gone up and up and up. And we know in part that they've gone up and up and up because of monetary policy. So that does not bespeak competency per se. If anything, it just means that they were early to a bubble, and one wonders if they'll figure it out and get out. So when it comes to this concept of elitism, I think we got to reframe there as well. The second category is sort of, I would say, the foreign policy elites. And these are folks that have gotten equally rich by fomenting wars all over the world, regime change, right, in Latin America, or interventions in the Middle East, right, for deployment of military forces all around the world. These are the people that think that no war is big enough, right? That we should try to pivot away from this disastrous war in Ukraine to fight an equally more disastrous war against China. And those people are embedded into the architecture of the government. So those are sort of the foreign policy elites. And then third, I would say, are sort of the domestic um, cultural revolutionaries. And these are people that are journalists. They're in the media industrial complex, right? They're active on Twitter. And these are people that are pushing transgenderism, open borders, right? Modern monetary theory. Maybe they have tenure at a university, and they have sort of poisoned the minds of the youth, right? So they're sort of fomenting revolution in some way, shape, or form, undermining the fabric of society. But again, that's self-destructive as well. So that's sort of the elite cadre that we're dealing with, and what they're doing summarily, Christian, is running the ship called the United States right into the ground. And I think in many ways they're not aware that that's happening, right? Because they're continuing to get rich, whether that's through government spending, or it's because they're getting paid at a university, or it's because they're Wall Streeters. So this is a very dangerous situation because the operators of the machinery of government or governance, both public and private, I think they are not competent. They are lacking in self awareness, most acutely. And they are not necessarily monolithic either. So it's not like they're following a particular strategy. They're just in their swim lane and they're pulling the system apart. And if you look at the Trump administration, that's exactly what you're seeing, right? You're seeing a new war in Venezuela. Well, foreign policy establishment, they're pushing that. You're hearing the president pivot when it comes to open borders, right? All of a sudden he's saying, well, we need to bring in H-1Bs. Well, what's that about? That's because of domestic lobbyists that are pushing that, right? So they're contorting the president in that direction. And then, of course, you've got the Wall Streeters. And the Wall Streeters are pushing, I would say, nothing short of Ponzi schemes like the Genius Act, which is an effort to create what's been called synthetic demand for U.S. Treasuries, which is a toxic asset that nobody wants to buy anymore, including the banks, by the way, through this gambit called stablecoins, right? And most recently, they're trying to democratize 401ks so that retail investors can go into private equity. And private equity, incidentally, is probably a bubble as dangerous and malignant as the subprime mortgage crisis was in 2008. And I'm given to understand it's about the same size. You're talking $4 or $5 trillion worth of a lot of toxic debt because a lot of private equity went into smaller business across this country, loaded it up with debt, tore it apart, restructured these companies, and now they can't refinance it because interest rates have risen. So the economy's a mess, and they're trying to find the next bag holder. Lo and behold, they're using retail investors to do it, and the Trump administration is signing off on it. Why? Because the financial elites are running his administration. So this is where we are. It's a very precarious situation, but it's unmasking the true scale of the corruption. And as I said, that is conducive to actually solving the problem. In order to solve these problems, you got to peel back the layers and say, okay, what is the rock bottom truth, and then you can start to fix it. We're still not there yet, but as I said, if Trump's administration implodes for the reasons I've mentioned, we're going to get there.
Well, you mentioned something that I think is so important. You mentioned that many of these elites are not as smart as they are sometimes portrayed to be, and I do agree. And you hear people use the term, hubris, as you know, as in those people being subject to that. And I do agree in terms of, I don't look at the world or the pyramid of power, so to speak, as kind of like, something from The Simpsons with Mr. Burns or whoever was,
Right.
sitting around a table like a cabal. I,
Right.
I I do see it as different factions, and like one faction that comes to mind is obviously like the WEF kind of faction, Brussels, and you've got kind of the Zionist faction, and I'm sure you have maybe a couple others, maybe
Sure.
the Silicon Tech, and
Sure.
then sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. And I think there is, and I'd love to hear your take. regarding theatrics of, some of the stuff that we see is kind of like WWE. I've heard some people frame it that way. I think it is very complex, and I have deviated away more and more as have uh, enlightened myself, so to speak, from kind of a more of a binary checkers form of outlook on politics in the world to more of, okay, well, framing it as more of like chess, and that it's incredibly complex, and there are so many actors, and it is just fascinating to hear people's takes on it, and also, um, I mean, how far the rabbit hole it can go sometimes. It's fascinating.
Well, what I've tried to do in this interview, and when I give these talks, is offer, what we call in the military a common operational picture. And it's very difficult to acquire that, in part because there's so much paradigmatic change that's happening all over the world. We just discussed China. Again, how many people are going to have the opportunity to go to that part of the world and really understand what's happened there since the 1980s? That's a pretty high hurdle. Certainly, most people in DC and in New York City are not going to do that because that's not conducive to upward mobility, right? If you want to climb inside those institutions, you have to follow a very specific path, and a lot of those paths sort of narrow you into certain specializations that undermine your ability to see the bigger picture. Okay, so that's part of it. The complexity that you mentioned is very important. In fact, it might be the most important characteristic in the world today. And I say that in part because in the United States, we tend to think in terms of systems. A lot of the rest of the world does not. They think in terms of people first. And I would argue that it's better to think in terms of people, human capital, culture, history, geography, language, right? To understand nations, understand regions than systems. And ultimately, every system, whether it's political, social, economic, or what have you, ultimately becomes a human system. And guess what? Human systems are nonlinear, they are chaotic, they are very, very difficult to control. And this is especially true in warfare, right? Because war is nothing if not dynamic. So each war is going to be very different. It's going to be fought on different ground. The tactics are going to be very different. And so what you're seeing essentially right now is a failure of older paradigms to come to grips with a world that's completely changed. This is why I would argue that the inescapable facts that we have to contend with in the world right now, just looking out before we talk more about what's happening inside the West, is that the United States proxy war in Ukraine, and you can pull the Europeans into it as well, has been an abject failure. They've lost. The Ukrainian regime that they've tried to prop up and the Russian government that they've tried to weaken, it's been the reverse of that. Basically, the Ukrainian armed forces are on the verge of collapse. The Ukrainian regime itself is imploding. And Russia's in a stronger position today, I would argue, and vociferously than they were in 2022, which, if you go back to 2022, absolutely nobody in Washington, D.C. in particular, and probably nobody in Brussels would ever have assumed such a thing. In fact, the consensus at the time was that there would be regime change in Russia, that Putin's regime would sort of internally collapse because of the weight of the sanctions. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And then people said, well, he'll lose on the battlefield. All we have to do is equip the Ukrainians with our first grade military equipment and tech, and that will turn the tide. And that has not happened. So that war has been lost, and it's come at a very high cost for the United States and a devastating cost for Ukraine. And that's going to reconfigure the security environment of Europe. It may bring down NATO, and there may be other collateral damage for that as well. So then you look at the Middle East, and we have, I think, shamelessly subsidized the Israelis in this humanitarian disaster in Gaza. And that has done, I think, serious damage to the reputation of the United States. Now, we've already had problems because of the mass interventionism that we talked about, weaponizing the dollar, et cetera, et cetera. But look, our affiliation with the state of Israel and the state of Israel itself has become a pariah around the world. That has done real damage to us. And again, that's sort of fueling backlash, not just in the United States, by the way, but also across Europe. And your audience may not know this, but there have been feverish sort of anti-Israeli sentiment across the European continent because tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, certainly tens of thousands of children, women and children, have been butchered, killed with a lot of military equipment that we provided. Again, that's sort of a paradigmatic shift, and we're now losing influence in the Middle East as a result, I would argue. And that came to count in this sort of 12-day skirmish with Iran, in which a lot of people thought that we were going to decapitate the Ayatollahs in Tehran, and that did not happen. If anything, Israel was extremely exposed, right? As were our supply chains. And then you sort of pivot to Asia, in which you have a trade war between China and the United States, and a lot of people thought that the Chinese would capitulate because they sort of did in 2018 and 2021. That did not happen. And what the Chinese have done is they've reorganized. So they've rerouted their trade agreements around the world, right? They have pivoted away from the United States and Europe, and instead they're investing in South America or in Eurasia, right? And they've done so, I would argue, very successfully. And as I said, they're the leading industrial power in the world. Um, this is just not well understood inside the Western world. So the reaction to that has actually accelerated those changes. So then domestically, if you evaluate what the Europeans have done in particular, well, they've doubled down on supporting the war, which has skyrocketed energy costs. And at the same time, they've stuck to this sort of environmental madness that's doing nothing less than deindustrializing most of the European continent at a time when they're already in recession. And maybe they've been in sort of a prolonged depression. It's hard to say. But that's now beginning to lower the standard of living in ways that's creating unrest in countries like Germany and France and Spain and Italy and Great Britain. Um, this dovetails with what you're seeing in the United States too, although I would argue that we're sort of on a lag timeline because things financially still haven't quite imploded here the way that they have there. But just consider the little soliloquy that I went through. There's a lot happening in all of that. And at the center of it is this financial system that is propping up all of these governments. And yet the warning signs are becoming more and more unignorable, whether that's inflation that appears to be persistent. And I share Jim Bianco's view that we're now in a new inflationary regime in which inflation is going to be 3% or higher going forward. I think that's true. That breaks the Fed's models, right? And bear in mind that this comes uh, after a very long rate hike. And now labor markets are starting to sort of roll over. And at the same time, you've got a new interest rate regime. And in this case, you've got a guy named Jeffrey Gundlach, who I think is the smartest guy on Wall Street. And he says we're in a new interest rate regime. So the 40-year bond cycle in which interest rates were persistently falling, that's over now. Now interest rates are starting to rise secularly. The Fed, central banks around the world, are incapable of dealing with this. They do not have a monetary framework to understand these changes, and that means the financial wreckage to come is uh, is going to devastate these governments. Right? We're talking about the Germans, the French, the Italians, the United States, Canada, certainly Great Britain as well. So it is a complex situation. The elites are not prepared to deal with it for the reasons that we've outlined. And I would go further and say the systems of governance that we've grown accustomed to for a long time, they're not equipped to deal with it either. And let me finish by saying this: the reflexive answer whenever I sort of give these talks is that, well, at the end of the day, they will just print. There's a serious problem with that. If printing money was the panacea to all monetary problems, every investor in the world would be long Zimbabwe stock or Venezuela, right? Why aren't they? Why isn't everybody piling into the Argentine stock market? So when I ask this question, people say, yeah, but the United States is not Zimbabwe. Okay. So then it's not liquidity, it's something else. And that something else, Christian, is confidence. Is confidence. People have faith. They still continue to trust monetary authorities. maybe they still believe the president of the United States, even though there's sort of growing discontent, even though things are getting worse, right? Even though the standard of living is falling, even though a lot of the promises that he made are not coming true, there's still residual faith and confidence. And that means people are going to continue to buy the dip until that confidence is broken. There's one other component here, and that is, and this is something that Michael Howell, who has a Substack called Capital Wars, which you should read if you have not. In order to print money, in order to introduce liquidity into the banking system, you also have to have collateral. Okay, and collateral basically means treasury bonds or asset-backed securities of some kind. The problem is that treasury bonds, since 2010, are experiencing a net exodus. So there's a secular decline in the value of the collateral that binds the entire financial system together. And furthermore, that means that a lot of these vehicles that are designed to plug these liquidity holes, whether it's in the repo markets or it's SOFR or it's a Treasury General account, well, guess what? Now the collateral that underlies it is starting to wobble. And that means you're going to see bankruptcies. That means you're going to see financial institutions blow up, hedge funds get liquidated. And I'll leave you with this. I read recently, and this was put out by the Fed, that the largest holder of long term treasury debt is not a sovereign wealth fund. It's not a foreign nation. It's not a pension fund or pension funds. It's actually hedge funds that are registered in the Cayman Islands. And I wonder what kind of counterparty risk is sitting on their balance sheets. So again, once you start to think mechanically about how all of these things are stitched together, then you realize, nope, the Fed can't just hit a button and fix it all. Actually, there's serious issues mechanically in the system, and the car is starting to sort of overheat because the engine's taking on fire. So that's where we are.
Absolutely fascinating discussion that we've had. Boy, I'm just kind of just digesting it candidly.
A lot.
Everything that
It's
you
a lot.
that you've shared.
But I will give you one more thing because this might help you sort of segue to your next question. But at the center of everything in the Western world, which has really been the focus of this conversation, is the younger generations, right? Because they are the future. And as difficult as everything we've discussed is, they are sort of being red pilled, right? They're awakening to a lot of these difficult truths, whether it's corruption in the government, right? Whether it's the reality of monetary policy, the bankruptcy of our institutions, right? Of the banking system writ large, and that means that they're mentally starting to figure out, hey, we gotta retool the whole damn thing, and that's the first step because then we can start to sort of organize ourselves to do so. So that will lead to a new order. That's not the end. It doesn't mean the end of the United States. We're not sort of going to experience a free fall uh, apocalyptically or anarchically. I don't think that's the way it's going to happen. I think the populations are going to spontaneously reorganize, mass mobilize is the term that I've used, to fix these problems. Because at the end of the day, nations are real things, right? We are all connected together in this thing called a community. And the community right now is hurt, it's sick. And ironically enough, when communities get sick, when there's an existential threat or crisis, they tend to congeal, they tend to come together. And that's what I think you're going to see happen, not just in the United States, but across the Western world.
Well, as it relates to that, I think of the Epstein files thing, how that has become a bipartisan, effort, and then also the whole Zionist influence, Netanyahu's government. It is very interesting, and as I've found myself agreeing with people that I previously, you know, have not agreed with, and it's been interesting to see that convergence. Um, as it relates to the community kind of readjusting, if you will. I guess I'll share my take, since most of the audience listening, as I mentioned you offline, is 50s and 60s. It is interesting how alternative media has had an impact on me and others that I know, and that I have very little faith in institutions and in the government. And this is coming from conservative family, several generations military, and I just don't trust it. I think it's systemic. It's almost like they need to do to DC that the Romans did to Carthage,
Yeah,
and so the ground was
yeah,
salt.
yeah,
Maybe I'm a history guy, so maybe
yeah.
keep DC and turn it into a museum. But it's like so
Yes,
systemic. It just blows my
yes.
mind. And then just another wrinkle to it is elements within these factions that are into various, call it a cult, and and I'm trying to get my train of my train of thought here back. Just that mixing, that this shadow banking, these intelligence agencies, the criminal activities that they're doing, that to maybe to a greater or lesser degree that we are governed. I don't know if you would agree with this, by pedophiles and by criminals to a greater or lesser degree. I'm not saying everybody, and I'm not saying also that there's not any good out there in, at the apex of power, but it does appear that it is very entrenched, and everyone is, not want to say everybody, but a lot of people, it seems, are compromised, and they've been subject to various forms of blackmail, and it's just, I mean, there's just so many different directions you could go with it.
Yeah, so two things I would offer in response to what you said. The first is regarding your awakening. Let's go with that, right? The skepticism that has led you to alternative sources of information, of news, right, of media, and probably encouraged you to create this platform, right? Why did you do that, and why has alternative media become so powerful that it's challenged corporate media as a business model? Okay, why has that happened? The reason is because propaganda doesn't actually work. And this is another false frame that most people have great difficulty with because they say, well, what the hell do you mean? If I go down to Starbucks and I talk to the average person, they're completely clueless about everything. And if I ask them basic questions about the government or about the monetary system or whatever, either they won't know or they'll repeat talking points that they've heard. Well, that may or may not be true. But what is true is that from 1996 forward, so in 1996, the Telecommunications Act was passed. And basically, what that did is it consolidated all media in the United States. You're talking about online media, newspapers, radio, television, etc., into just a few major corporations. It corporatized the media in ways that the banking system consolidated post 2008. Okay. Um, if you were to graph out, and I have essays addressing this, so if you're curious, you can read through the material yourself. If you are to graph trust in mainstream media from 1996 forward, so again, post consolidation, in which they basically controlled the entire media landscape, and that really didn't change until 2010, 2015, maybe. What you will see is a precipitous collapse of confidence in mainstream media, even though these platforms were incredibly powerful, right? And they controlled the narrative. They were the gatekeepers to virtually all of the ideas that we discussed. And if you recall, the apotheosis of this control was the election in 2016. It's one of the reasons why the polls were wrong about Donald Trump, because the vast majority of media coverage about the president during the campaign was negative. I mean, it was like over 90% of all of the corporate media was steadfastly against President Trump, and he won anyway. And this created a traumatizing event for the legacy media, for the government. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Christian, but I was in D.C. at the time, and nobody inside the Beltway believed that Donald Trump was going to win. Absolutely nobody. I mean, well over 90% voted for Hillary Clinton, and they sort of regarded Trump and his supporters as deplorables themselves, a very condescending, dismissive way. And so it came as a profound shock because they thought, I'm talking about sort of the governmental elites in the United States, that they were in control of the narrative, that propaganda had successfully brainwashed the population. And needless to say, it was quite the opposite. And furthermore, after the election, then you saw a massive campaign of censorship in which you saw a lot of people on platforms like YouTube purged, right? They were deplatformed, demonetized. And the assertion then was, or the assumption then was, well, that will terminate these sort of alternative views. And what did they do? They reorganized in alternative media. That is even more powerful today than it was 10 years ago. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing regarding this sort of dark underbelly of who's actually governing the country. Look, late cycle empires, um, nation states, civilizations, and I don't believe we're late cycle, by the way. So let me be clear on that. In fact, I would argue the United States is more of like an adolescent. We're not even 500 years old. And having been to countries like China or Russia, you're talking about nations that are at least 1,000 years old. The Han Dynasty, which was one of the most powerful in Chinese history, was around during the Roman Empire. You just think about that. And it was a Chinese ethno state. Okay. China is the longest running, longest standing ethno state in the world. Amazing, incredible, thousands of years of history. Okay. So if you consider that kind of timeline, the United States is still sort of figuring itself out, which is why I said we are experiencing a crisis of identity. Who are we really? What do we really believe? How do we want to be governed, et cetera, et cetera? However, we experienced a profound building period from about 1870 to 1970. The standard of living rose, and I would argue that this was an achievement of uh, of industrial capacity, of technological revolution that stands as some of the great one of the greatest in the history of humankind. Okay, electrification, right? The internal combustion engine, um, launching rockets into space. I mean, tremendous leaps forward. The elites, if you will, the building class that built those things, the successors of them have degenerated, right? They are these sort of asset holders that I mentioned earlier. They're not builders. And building tends to happen in times of scarcity. So what I've done is I've sort of said we are coming out of an age of prosperity and we're going into an age of scarcity. And the age of scarcity is the building period because then you have to prioritize long-term thinking, right? You have to invest for the future. It's when you have to build strong families. You have to have many children, right? Because times are tough, resources are constrained. That's when the building actually happens. And that's when you get a sort of new cadre of elites that are actually technically competent. That's what we had from about 1870 until 1970. Okay. What we've had over the last 50 years is an age of prosperity and a degeneracy of the elites. And that typically coincides with corruption. It tends to coincide with these elite groups that splinter in different ways. A lack of supervision, a lack of oversight, because hey, everything is abundant, so anything goes. Live for today, forget tomorrow. And I've sort of gendered these too. I think the age of prosperity is a very feminine time, and the age of scarcity is a very masculine time. And femininity tends to be about prosperity, right? It tends to be about wealth and comfort, whereas masculinity is hardship and construction, material building, all of these sorts of things. So what I'm suggesting to you is that there is a dark underbelly. It is being unmasked, but fundamentally speaking, it's associated with a dilapidated structure, and that dilapidated structure is simply imploding and it needs to be rebuilt. And that's what we're going to do. So you're seeing a new elite emerge. That's what's manifest in the influencer class and alternative media. And that's only going to gain strength, which is what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years. It will not exclusively be political. It will be new economy, right? New corporate structures, new institutions, probably a new kind of Wall Street, probably new kinds of universities. That's where we're headed because the entire legacy structure is bankrupt. And just to be clear with you, and this might stun you, Harvard's endowment fund recently had to contract a debt just to keep the lights on at Harvard because the endowment fund is exposed to a lot of the malinvestment in the financial system. They haven't run their books properly. And that's true across the university world. right? I mean, you're talking about thousands and thousands of colleges and universities, most of which have been very poorly managed. So you have a lot of bloat, a lot of administrative overhead uh, that has nothing to do with education, and they've been subsidized by the government, right? So again, no supervision, no oversight, no innovation. What's the answer? Bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is the disinfectant. It will force feed a constraint, a limitation of resources that will then reprioritize everything. And I would say the word I have used to describe this is definancialization. This is why I said earlier, tariffs are never going to work because Trump got the sequence wrong, right? You got to definancialize. You got to fix these allocators of resources first. And principally, that's Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And what are both of those places associated with? A lot of the dark underbelly and corruption that you're talking about. Those institutions, those power centers, they're broken every bit as much as DC. That means we got to crash before we recover.
Okay, so you covered a couple things, and let me know if you need to pivot. I think we have another 15, 20
Go
minutes. I
for
think
it.
you're good on, but
Go for it.
I was going to comment on the you mentioned the feminine in terms of prosperity, and then the masculine in terms of scarcity, which I'd love to dive into
Yeah.
real quick, and then also the
Yeah.
intersex, or I don't even know if that's the right term, the relationship dynamic that exists between men and women, particularly the younger demographic, if you will. And I'll comment, you mentioned about kind of the decadence that kind of exists, and I really enjoy reading about different periods. That has been a common theme, and that's something that I've shared, I think, on some of the episodes with the audience if they've tuned into that. That similar consistent pattern. And then also it is interesting how I think about our grandparents generation, like where very frugal, very thrifty, right, recycling things, recycling printed paper, print on the backside of it, just to then I even found with myself, kind of being cavalier with resources that had been given to me, and so on and so forth, and and having to, okay, learn the hard way, and then figure out, okay, this is the way. Don't do that. Don't you know keep up with the Joneses, play that game. And so, and I love that you mentioned that. I also want to add that, I feel like throughout the collective memory, by and large, leaders, whether that was you were a leader of a city state, or a nation, a kingdom, what have you, possessed a well-roundedness, right? They were expected to be like a warrior king, lead from the front. Thinking of like Frederick the Great, I'm thinking of Bonaparte, Charlemagne, Washington, even at times, which is crazy to think that George Washington is literally leading forces at times in the very front of an engagement. And then you think about today, how everything is so divorced, so removed, right? Leaders are just so divorced from the ground, and boots on the ground, and with troops. And and so I'm using that as an analogy in that, like it seems like societies were run that way. And then I think the last vestige of that might have been like Eisenhower. Not that well, I don't know his specific history, but I know, obviously being Supreme Allied Commander there over in Europe. Um, and then now we've gotten a society where, yeah, people are, um, laissez-faire. People are just soft, and such. And it'll take some impetus. It'll create pain to bring that out again, whereby people go back to more conservatism. And I know people mention Rome, and it's very cliche. I do remember listening to a podcast talk about the early Republican days, pre-empire, people being very conservative, and certain attributes. And then after the civil wars, and then going into the empire, it was interesting to note, the degeneracy. People stopped wanting to have kids. And I know Augustus, for those who don't know, the first emperor, how he tried to pass legislation for people to have kids, to have
Yep.
families. And it very
Yep.
interesting. And when I was listening to that podcast, which came out 10 years ago, I think it's called The History Room. I encourage people to check it out if they haven't. And it came out like 10 years ago, Cameron. And I just, how relatable is that today? I get it. So it's so cliche because everybody references Rome.
Yes. Yes. So I'll begin by mentioning J.D. Unwin, who wrote a book called Sex and Culture. And the thesis of Sex and Culture was essentially that the liberalization of female sexuality, it represents the downfall of virtually every civilization that's documented in human history. Now, I would not go so far as to say that. What I would say is that the liberalization is symptomatic of the kind of problems that we've discussed in this podcast, right? But at core, what you have is a spiritual crisis. And in the West right now, and increasingly, this is problematic in many parts of the world, particularly in developing countries, whether you're talking about China, Japan, countries that are rapidly urbanizing or have already urbanized, where there's large concentrations of wealth. What you have here is a kind of spiritual crisis. And that spiritual crisis is the disruption of a relationship between men and women. And now I'm speaking specifically about the United States. And that relationship is rooted in archetypes. Now, archetypes is a word that I use quite a bit. It's a bit esoteric, but really, I think fundamentally speaking, you're talking about the prime operating software that directs whatever in the world. So, masculine and feminine are basic operating systems that drive society, right? It's why men, or let's say boys, at very young ages, play with toys, and they like to play war outside, right? And girls sort of do the opposite, right? They like to play with dolls and so forth. And again, these things are fungible to some degree. Not every girl wants to do that. Not every boy wants to do it. Yeah, we understand that. But archetypically speaking, that's the way it functions. Okay. And it's not so much that a hierarchy emerges based on that, as much as you have a complementary relationship. And that complementary relationship is effectively the family. And courtship is what leads to that family structure. There is a respect for the head of household, in this case, the father. And the father, the man, is archetypically masculine because he demonstrates leadership capability, right? He focuses the family in a particular direction, right? Be that through his economy, his income, right? His career trajectory, the skill set that he has, the value system, the worldview, all of these things tie into that. But that is effectively the navigation of the family. And the female typically was designed to cultivate the family inside of that structure, right? Not just to reproduce, but also to nurture, right? To create a sort of stability and balance inside the structure that that man was trying to build. Well, that relationship has been completely frayed. And yes, it's been frayed because of, you might say, poisonous ideas to some degree. But it's also, I think, to some degree, it has been undermined because of modernity itself, right? We're adapting to a new kind of world that does not invalidate archetypes at all. In fact, it strengthens them. But it does mean that things look a little bit different. Okay. The challenge, however, right now is that you have a generation, maybe two, of females that have been they've been cultivated in an environment or indoctrinated in an environment in which men are basically superfluous. They're unnecessary. Um, and they're economically unnecessary because of the state, right? The state which provisions women with virtually whatever they need, particularly single mothers, um, with benefits that are provided through redistribution. But this is what's interesting is that that redistribution has to be subsidized by the labor of men. Now, why would men commit themselves laboriously or otherwise to creating economic value if they're denied the fruits of that value, specifically access to a woman, the creation of a household, right? And sort of navigating society in that direction that we started with. Well, that has been denied to a lot of these men. And so now they're divesting from society. Their labor is no longer subsidizing that excess, that largesse, right, that provides the redistribution that allows the females to render the male superfluous. In other words, you have a kind of parasitic economic relationship going on here, and that's going to break because it's unsustainable, right? Because you have fewer and fewer men that are less and less productive, right? and a larger and larger share of women that are more and more dependent, and some men too. Okay. In addition to that, you have things like feminism, which have sort of weaponized this economic relationship in a hostile way against masculinity itself. Okay, so that has sort of removed the father as head of household. It has invalidated his authority. So now the family structure itself is broken down fundamentally. However, archetypes ultimately adapt and they prevail. So even though you have this environment in which women are sort of climbing economically, they're increasingly unhappy. They're increasingly single. They're increasingly childless. This is not desirable by most women. And I would suggest that that is red pilling a lot of younger women. Hey, I don't want to get on that cycle. Okay, so that's part of it. And remember that online dating and social media have obviously supplemented, or rather, they have exaggerated a lot of these effects too, right? Because people don't meet in person the way that they used to. In any case, it's done a lot of damage to females, but it's also done a lot of damage to men. And so men are becoming more masculine, not less masculine. They're embracing a new kind of politics, which is more traditional, right? Which is more conservative. So they're actually rejecting this sort of feminist environment or this feminist structure because there's no reward for them, because it denies that archetypal desire that's within them. That means you're going to get a reset, a rebalance. And that's what we're starting to see. There is evidence, for example, that online dating has peaked, that increasingly people are rejecting it, that there are new networks that are emerging to facilitate courtship in person, right? And young men in particular are becoming more religious, not less religious, because they're sort of looking for some spiritual path that can offer them a way out of a very defective system. This is the beginning, in other words, of a reset, of a kind of renaissance. Um, Economically speaking, it will accelerate that because once those resources go scarce, then all of a sudden you're going to see a sort of retrenchment of the archetypes together. Families will get stronger. And this is the problem, by the way, Christian, with a lot of linear analysis that assumes that, well, basically, you go from good to great and it just keeps going, or you go from bad to worse and it just keeps going. This is not the case. Society is dynamic, right? It's chaotic, it's nonlinear, it goes in different directions. What I'm suggesting to you and your audience is that we have some agency, we have some effect in shaping the destiny of not just our household and our lives, but our nations as well. And that's why these men are coalescing into groups online. It's why you're beginning to see that manifest politically in things like America First, and this is just the beginning. So, in other words, we're leaving this age of prosperity of abundant resources, which is really a mirage that has propped up unsustainable bubbles like female empowerment, okay, which really means male disempowerment. And now we're going back into a sort of age of scarcity that will rebalance that out. The question that you're probably going to ask me is, well, how long is that going to take and what's the collateral damage? And I suspect that it's going to take a decade. And what I've told a lot of men, so I'm 40, I am single, I do not have children. Do I plan to have children? Yes. But as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, that's a very precarious proposition these days, right? For all kinds of reasons that we don't need to go into. But the bottom line is that I would say probably the older half of millennials, so from about 30 to 40, most of them may not end up married or with children. And their purpose is going to be to take part in this reset, right? To sort of foment the shift back in the positive direction, the masculine direction that we're talking about. That is going to be their purpose. But I think for the younger millennials, they'll have a much better shot because as the values resurface, as the archetypes reset themselves, you'll find more and more women that want to get married again, that want to have children, and I think that the financial mess will facilitate that. Right, people will become less materialistic but become more focused on grounded human affairs and community. And as I said, I think there's already evidence that that's beginning to happen.
Absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I agree with you. I think that you know, there are a myriad of things that are kind of leading that into the direction, and I suspect that that pendulum will swing back into more of a traditional viewpoint. And I'm like you, you know, I mentioned I'm 32, and I almost got married 6 years ago. Bought the house, you know, had to move in and did the whole, you know, what couples do and all, and then that didn't work out, and so long story short, I have kind of divorced myself from trying to put myself out there, uh, and um, and I look at it as this, and if you need to go, let me know. But even if one finds somebody who is traditional, if the environment that they're in is not conducive, like for example, like you know, if you're a traditional man, you want to find a traditional woman, but you are in, let's say, L.A., in the heart of L.A., might be kind of more challenging, right? To because of the environment, and so I feel like the environment needs to change. I feel like the state needs to go down dramatically in size. It needs to stay out of people's affairs, especially as it relates to relationships in the family unit. And yeah, I think they just totally have royally screwed it up, like just royally. Just I'm just candidly not really a fan of the state, you know, just in general. And um, I think just last century, I think they killed like 200 million people, the state
Yeah.
collectively. And so, that's a far switch. I'm going off on a tangent there, but I just feel like just getting so entrenched and so involved. I think it's just it hasn't served us, and I think people have to have some type of foundation. Religion has to, of course, historically been that means that platform. But yeah, it is really interesting to observe. But yeah, I'm just watching and watching the show, and you know, just trying to show up. You reminded me of David Data's book, The Way of the
Yep.
Superior Man, that first introduced me to
Yep.
the polarity, the masculine, and the feminine, and I know what your thoughts are on Richard Cooper. I thought that he's made some interesting points. Corey Wayne's brought up some interesting ones here. I remember following him in college. Um, yeah, it's just really fascinating to witness and observe. Yeah, it manifests, especially America First.
Well, what I would say is try to avoid the black pill. You know, this is a recurring theme that I emphasize on my channel. Why do I use the term neo? Right? Because we're not just talking about traditionalism. No, traditionalism has its place to be sure, but we are in a new kind of battlefield, right? So the neo masculinity is about awakening. It's about revolt, right? It's about resurrection. And that's a little bit different from traditionalism. You know, conservatism tends to be a rather passive activity. What I'm talking about is a far more active kind of masculinity, a more assertiveness, right? A more self confident masculinity. And a term that I've used is masco nationalism because what you're seeing is not simply a rejection of feminism, but a rejection of multiculturalism across the Western world, or multiracialism, um, by young men who champion the nation because they understand what a nation is. A nation is an extended family. It is a community of sorts. And so they know that if we lose the nation, then you've lost your community, you've lost your family. And that means that your opportunity to reproduce, right, to create your kingdom, if you will, that's gone as well. And that's why they're coming together, right? That's the neo, the sort of archetype that's reorganizing itself in a more aggressive fashion to fight back against the forces of evil. And I think they are evil in many ways, right? Because they're deliberately undermining, if you will, the natural forces, the metaphysical properties that make us human beings. And that throws into sharp relief the importance of the age that we're living in, right? So I am actually very optimistic because the younger that I go, so if I talk to a guy who's 30 or 25 or 20, the awareness levels are staggering. You know, people at that age, young men in particular, are really starting to figure things out at a very high level. So I have conversations like this with them all the time. And number one, they process and understand most of what we've discussed. And secondly, they tend to share the direction of travel that I'm suggesting. Whereas as you start to go older, that's when you encounter resistance, in part because you're talking about people through no fault of their own necessarily, but they're invested in a system that's dying and a system that we, by virtue of being younger, have never really invested in, right? We don't have homes. We're not married. We don't have children because there's no place for us in that sort of bastardized legacy society. Again, I called it pluralism, right? Where the social convention is basically that the United States' national identity is that it has no identity. And again, that hasn't worked. What it's done is it's strengthened identity in that youth that is beginning to awaken to who it really is, right? That those archetypes are coming back again. So we're living in extraordinary times, and the base layer of the legacy system, which is the financial system, is blowing up. And that's a very good thing. I'm not suggesting that the transition is going to be easy. I'm not suggesting there's not going to be a lot of collateral damage. What I am saying is it's going to be a liberating effect because all of a sudden, a lot of the impediments to building for the long term, to actually allocating resources properly, those impediments are going to be gone. And remember that um, real economic wealth, if you look up GDP, it'll say GDP is the allocation of scarce resources. This is false. Real wealth is the allocation of scarce human resources, right? It's how you allocate human capital. And how do we allocate human capital today to the extent that we do it at all? Because remember, most of the country is living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have a legitimate career. They have no path to social upward mobility at all. That means they're wasted human capital. Okay. And Wall Street and Silicon Valley are just making that worse. As I said, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, they're concentrating the human capital that we have, but they're basically taking the best minds that we've got, and instead of building rockets, right, or inventing new mathematical models, right, or curing disease, right, or reforming the political system, what are they doing? They're basically making a lot of money in a Ponzi scheme. They're becoming experts at arbitrage, at pump and dump, and that's killing us. So we've got to break that financial hold, that grip on our country. And the good news is, I think the financial elites that dominate the Trump administration, they're doing it to them. They're doing it to themselves. Right? They're imploding as we speak because, as I said, they're not competent, they're not self-aware, and they're not terribly monolithic. They're all trying to squeeze what's left out of a system that's rapidly draining itself of economic energy. Call that profit or revenue or liquidity, what have you. And that's why you're seeing these policies, whether it's the stable coin gambit, right? Or it's democratizing 401ks, because the big boys, the BlackRocks of the world, they are in trouble. They've got to find pools of liquidity and capital to squeeze. I don't know if you know this, but there was an article, I think it was put in either the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, by Larry Fink, and he said globalization needs a second draft, and he proposed baby bonds. And basically, what it was an argument for is transforming newborn babies into financial assets. Just think about that, right? That's the ultimate expression of financialization, and that's the end of the system, right? When you have to sort of collateralize babies, you're done. You've squeezed everything else out of the system. So you're talking about a system that's on empty. Sort of like I don't know if you ever watched Seinfeld, but I think there's an episode where Kramer is driving a car and empty through the whole episode, right? And it just keeps going and going and going, and then finally towards the end of the episode, it just runs out of gas and stops, and that's where we are.
Well, Cameron, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I love how we touched on it. And I would like to do this more with other uh, guests, where we cover an array of topics: social, political, economic, etc. Which I think is I feel like the most value you can offer. The audience. Love what you're doing, and you have certainly traveled a lot more than I have, and you're inspiring me to get out there and travel. Um, so that's something I plan on doing here in the coming years. Go all around Europe and Asia and so on and so forth. And it's been a real pleasure to have you on. And how can people learn more about you and to get in touch with you?
Sure. So I have a YouTube channel that goes under the moniker Neo Masculinity. You can also just type in Cameron McGregor Men in the City, and you'll see a lot of content there. I have a Substack that's also called Men in the City that you can find, and I tend to put out an essay once a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, but generally speaking, that's about the size of it. I also have Instagram, which is also Neo. I think it's Neo underscore masculinity, and you can find me on Twitter as well. Although I tend to stay off Twitter, I find it to be a little bit toxic, so I don't go on there as much as the other platforms. And I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Backlash, which is about America's awakening and the sort of next stage of the country, and it addresses many of the ideas that I laid out here uh, this evening or whenever you see this. So you can find me there, and I look forward to seeing you.
Absolutely. Well, you take care, and I hope to have you on sometime in the near future to hear your your latest thoughts as we're in this. I feel like very volatile and very dynamic environment that we're in.
Absolutely, we are.
Quick ask: over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's of course free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.